It's hyperbole to say we would not be where we are today in terms of a congregation, a building, a rabbi, or anything else that we are that is wonderful without these two gentlemen. So please join me in welcoming them.
This microphone thing is, makes it a little intimidating. Now you can actually hear what I am saying. Yes. So I'm going to ask for you to indulge me for a second and let me tell you a little bit about my wife, Lisa. Some of you know Lisa, but most of you may not. She, of late, has become a very serious student of neuroscience. She reads everything, mostly audiobooks that she can get her hands on, just because she's fascinated by the topic. And what I've learned from her, because she's always telling me each night what she's learned that day, I'm talking about 3 or 4 hours a day that she spends on this, is that memories, unlike what you might think, are not stored in one place in your brain, but they're broken up into little pieces, and the sound of your memories is in one place, and the sights and the smells, the storyline, they're all in different parts of your brain. So when you go to remember something, your brain has to pull from all these different places and put together your memory. In a way, what it's doing is, wait for it, reconstructing the memory. She'll be thrilled that I told you this tonight. She'll be absolutely thrilled. So this is by way of a disclaimer. I'm going to do my best to pull from all the corners of my brain to reconstruct the memories that I have. Going back to my first time visiting Beth Evergreen, which was in 1984. So the synagogue was already 10 years old at that time. And I had just arrived with Lisa to the little town of Evergreen. We really didn't know anybody, didn't know anything about this place. But we did find in the Canyon Courier a listing that high holiday services would be held at the Methodist Church. So we were thrilled to hear that. And we proceeded to arrange to be there. It was one of those unusually early snows, and it was very cold, and we arrived to the Methodist Church to be greeted by this statuesque woman in a full-length mink coat and stiletto heels. It was Renee Bernstein. And we just didn't know what to make of this at all. We said, where exactly are we? And we were greeted warmly and got a big hug. She didn't know who we were, and we didn't know who she was. We soon came to learn that the Bernsteins, at that point in time in the congregation, were really kind of the backbone of what was going on here. She was running the religious school. Steve was the president of the congregation, and they were the engines at that moment that were responsible for more or less everything that was happening at Beth Evergreen. So we became fast friends with the Bernsteins, and I didn't get very involved at that time. I was getting my feet on the ground with a career here, and wasn't as active as I would have liked to have been. And we only lasted 2 years in Evergreen before I had to leave and go back to my previous job in Northern California. But 8 years later, we returned, and so it was the summer of '94 that we returned. In '84, the congregation had no rabbi. It was not affiliated. It didn't have a building. It was very generously offered space by the United Methodist Church, which was an incredible relationship that we had with that church that I don't think we can ever thank them enough for that period in our history. Services were held on Friday nights in people's homes, right? And I'm looking at folks in the audience to help me verify that the pieces of my brain are pulling from the right places. And it was only the high holidays that we were holding at the Methodist Church at that time, right? That's with their, so sometimes a Friday night service would be held there as well. Okay. So fast forward 10 years to 1994, and we arrived back, built our home in Pine this time, and we were very excited to get back in touch with Beth Evergreen. And at that time, it didn't have a rabbi, it didn't have a building, and it was not affiliated. So in many ways, we felt like we were kind of picking up where we left off. But there had been discussion on all three of those topics. The congregation was, in many ways, a unique congregation insofar as the members were coming from all different parts of the Jewish spectrum, conservative and reform and very liberal and much more conservative. But I didn't ever notice any conflict in regards to traditions. Everyone was just so happy to have a congregation up here and to be together as a community. The term was coined, and I don't know who coined it, maybe somebody here can help me, but we were coined as mountain Jews, because Jews didn't live in the mountains. Jews lived in cities. Jews lived in suburbs. And so to be a mountain Jew was something very unusual, very unique. Jews didn't live in the woods. I mean, what kind of Jews would live in the woods, right? You know, where was the deli? where was everything that made Jewish life Jewish? So the term mountain Jews really stuck to the congregation, and it became very meaningful. It meant that we had a very independent streak, that we were very capable, that we were able to lead and have our own services with people that were extremely knowledgeable, who could read Torah, who knew the stories of the Talmud and the Bible, and we were very, very proud as a congregation of our independence and our capability, and the fact that we didn't have the trappings of all those large congregations down the hill. Our dues, if I recall, were somewhere around $67 a year. To cover the cost of the newsletter. We had no paid staff. It was a fully volunteer organization. And all of those things made us very unique and very proud to be members of Beth Evergreen at that time. I'm going to pass it to Rich for a few comments. I don't want to do all the talking.
Going.
Okay. Okay, yes, Uncle Max is on my list. So let's get to Uncle Max. Yes, this was 84. So Uncle Max, I'm not the one to introduce who Uncle Max was. I'm sure you knew him much better than I did. Sally, tell us about Uncle Max. No.
No, he was a lawyer. But he was very religious scholar. Very smart, very well educated. Sort of like Joanne, a religious scholar, among other things. A religious scholar. So we called him Uncle Max, and maybe other people called him Uncle Max as well. He wasn't exactly our uncle, but he would come up and assist us with services. Lead some services. Where did we get a prayer book? The first prayer books we had. The first prayer books we had were, remember that there were 8 of us, and we were in Bernie Goldman's house. I had a prayer book, Bernie had a prayer book, not the same. You know, forget about page 82. So we all had prayer books, and you spent, did the quick show. Oh, yeah, what was that? Some of us knew what the prayers were. Some of us read Hebrew. Some of us didn't. Then Bernie had a dog who had saved his life, and the dog was part of the thing in his house, and the dog would walk up and down. And somebody said, you know, we should have a prayer book. I had a source of prayer books. I got the prayer book that we had, but it was Orthodox. And as we're paradox. So we had that prayer book. When by the time Rabbi Baskin came, he got us new prayer books. But first we had a melange of prayer books, and then and that was long before we got our Torah. Remember that? Yeah. You know about what happened? I have trouble not choking up, but here we go. Steve Feldman, and nobody knew this except did you know this? Were you there? I haven't heard yet. Well, it was a Saturday service. It was right before, I think it was maybe Rosh Hashanah, I'm not sure. But Rabbi Baskin said, and I've given this away already, there's a member of our congregation that is new to come into the services here. She is a Holocaust survivor. She's quite old, and she's been doctored up a little. And I want you to respect her and give her the respect that her age demands. And in they came carrying the Torah. And she's been with us ever since. Yeah. Hmm?
You've got so many more stories than I have.
No, I want to tell a story on you. It was the time that Rabbi Baskin was sick, and it was Yom Kippur. He was sick, and everybody was sick. There were 5 people who were sick and couldn't come, and we couldn't have this, we couldn't have that. And you said, well, is it proper for an instrument to do kol nidre? And we looked deeply into the Talmud. And we said, you know, it says in Psalm 150, you should bring the trumpets, bring the timbrel, play, sing.
Does it mention a flugelhorn?
Of course it mentioned the flugelhorn. Tell me it didn't mention the flugelhorn. And was silent, and came these notes of kol nidre. Now, we have it now, but it was a complete surprise. This sound that filled that place, and everybody went right out of their socks altogether. And we listened to this thing, and it was absolutely stunning. And I never asked him to pay me back for the socks that are still in the Methodist Church. It was illuminating. It was, and especially as it was a surprise. There was no other people there who could play or sing, and now we have all of this to do that we can do. Wow. Thank you.
But that was the nature of the congregation at that time. We did everything ourselves. And that was who we were at that time. If you wanted to get something done, you did it yourself. And this was just one example of many, many, many that the congregation, each member of the congregation contributed what they had to contribute. And that was what made us really unique. We had a cantor, an Israeli singer who joined us for High Holidays. Yossi was his name. And Yossi got called to Israel that year for, I think his father either was ill or maybe passed away. and wasn't able to be with us. And it was a very last minute notification that we got from Yossi that he wouldn't be able to sing Kol Nidre and be at the service. And of course, you're going to have high holiday services no matter what, and you got to have Kol Nidre, right? So everybody chips in. That's all. That's the way it was back in that time. Dick and Lois, do you have anything you want to add about that period?
I think Doreen should be mentioned. Those of you who remember Doreen, who unfortunately died of COVID during the pandemic, she was, when we moved here in 1979, we wanted to find out if there were any Jews, and we wound up talking to Doreen, and she opened up a whole new world for us. And it was larger than 8 people, but it still was very small, and we were still doing everything that day. Your turn.
I remember our very first service, which it was one of the high holidays, and they had this great big elk on the wall.
Oh, yes.
Right? And you can't have an elk hanging out. Where was it? It was up at Lookout Mountain?
No.
No. Uh,
It's in Upper Bear Creek.
mm.
Yeah.
And so, I don't remember who did it, Joe, but they covered it with a sheet so you don't have the big elk. And also remember our daughter's bat mitzvah, which was the first bat mitzvah for CBE. And we did it in a tent at the top of our driveway.
But you need to mention that.
And Joanne, you had a incident coming up to our house or something? No, with the fire department or the police or something. I mean, here.
Okay. Here is this lovely bat mitzvah that the girls, and in those days we did everything because it said do everything, so I said do everything. I was tutor for those kids, and they did the whole Torah portion, the whole maftir, and they did the whole haftarah, all of it. And so we got ready, and there was this lovely tent, and next door there was a big accident. And the fire came, and the police, and the 4th of July, and the NAACP, and the ACLU, and all of the people were there. And she said to herself, I think, let them do what they do. It's very nice. I'm going to go ahead with this. And she did, and we did. And we were having a bat mitzvah over here, and 20 feet away, the ambulance and the chaos and the bibbity bobbity boo. Yeah.
I'm missing, so many pieces of the story, but there's just so many stories to tell. With Max Frankel in my mind, he was like a grandfather, a wise Jewish grandfather figure. And, every time he opened his mouth, it was a great story of Jewish wisdom. And yeah, he did repeat his stories. he tended to be a little long-winded, and as a matter of fact, he told my favorite Max story is he was asked to speak at some event or some occasion, and on a topic he was very familiar with, and the person asking him said, "Well, how long will you need, to prepare for this?" And he says, "Well, it depends on how long you want me to speak for." And the person said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, if you want me to speak for a short period of time, 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to need several weeks to prepare. If you don't care how long I speak, I'm ready to go right now." And that was Max in a nutshell. So when we arrived back here in 1994, the congregation was holding most of their services at the church at that time, still running the show pretty much by themselves, very capably, and Max was still there helping out, I believe. But there was some talk about whether we were ready to grow into a more, grow up as a congregation with a building, with affiliation, with rabbi. Those were the three big topics: a building, affiliation, and rabbi. And a survey the congregation was surveyed because it was clear that, as small a congregation as it was, and I don't know if it was even 50 families, there was probably 150 opinions on the subject. So right before we arrived in town, the survey had been taken and completed, and there was a positive vote on all three topics. Not by a lot, some slightly larger than others, but in my recollection, there was a small margin on all three. Do you recall that? Yeah. So the question became, what do we do now? Which comes first? How do we go about doing this? How are we going to afford it? Tons and tons of questions about how to proceed. And the board started wrestling with these, and there was lots and lots of discussion, lots of meetings about it. And it was all good discussion. It went on in living rooms where the board meetings were held. Steve Picard's living room, I think your living room probably hosted some as well. That it was basically something went on for more than a couple of years. The discussions about what do we do now and how do we proceed and so on. I was asked by Steve Bernstein if I would take over as president after Carl Boymel was president, and at that point, the presidents had agreed to do 2 terms, and I said, two-year terms. I said, that's 4 years. That's a long time. It wasn't required, but that's kind of the tradition, is that they were doing 2-year terms. I said, I'd consider doing it, but only for 1 term. If I can't get some stuff done in 1 term, I shouldn't be the president. So I became the president in 97, and the meeting where I became the president was held at, what's the building there where the center stage building. In the center stage building, they had a all-purpose room. And in the middle of the meeting, one of our congregants stood up, and he was a quiet, soft-spoken man. He was an antique bookseller, and was not somebody who stood out in a crowd necessarily. He stood up and he said, we've been talking about this building thing for a long time, but we're not really getting very far with it. My mother has just passed, and she left in her will a bequeath of $100,000 to Congregation Beth Evergreen for the purpose of starting a building fund. So we finally had something that was actionable. We had to do something because somebody gave us money. We couldn't ignore this gift. And it was Paul Rothman and his generosity and his mother's generosity that started the entire process of what we see right here today. I'm going to now pass this to Rich.
Most recently, I saw 2 presidents or former presidents in a debate, and it was remarkable to see the fact checking that needed to be done. And I'm just suggesting that we need a myth checker. So if we're going to build meaning into our stories, and so I'm not going to hold myself to the facts of any of these things. But you can, who's heard of the term imposter syndrome? Yeah, okay. So how do you explain imposter syndrome?
I live it.
Me too.
Yeah, I am the definition of it. Well, for a while there, I was like, here's a good example. I was the graphic designer and web developer for the Counseling Center at the University of Illinois for a while, and I had studied neither one of those ever. So I felt all the time that I was just making it up. So that's sort of how I feel about imposter syndrome.
Okay. That's always how I feel. I'm sitting next to David Froman in front of a bunch of people with all of this history, all of this commitment, and I feel like a massive imposter. Like someone's gonna run up here and say, "You don't even belong here." So, but in a way, there's truth in that. By the way, that's no false humility. That in a group like this, and in my presence in a group like this, every time I'm invited to stand up at the front of anything in this group, as I look out, I see the brilliance in the room, the commitment in the room, sort of people who live community, and I just don't necessarily feel anywhere near the task. And so our family moved here in 1995, and we didn't move here for Beth Evergreen, but we live here because of Beth Evergreen. So we found our home, and it was just a few short blocks by the standard of what we call a block as Mountain Jews. That means hairpin turns, blind curves, deer jump in front of you, from Congregation Beth Evergreen, or otherwise known as the United Methodist Church. And I took my small gaggle, my wife and our 3 children, who at the time were diapers, right? My son, when we first moved here, was well under a year, 6, 7 months. And, basically we have triplets, right? Michelle, Mimi, and Jesse, they're all about the same age. They're sort of nearly indistinguishable in that regard. And we started to go to Congregation Beth Evergreen services at the United Methodist Church. And I'll tell you a quick story about the United Methodist Church. First of all, it was fantastic. And it so firmly set the model for what became of Congregation Beth Evergreen in its period of time of transition. So that group of persons, that group of soulful spiritual community, became a model for what we became. And I didn't go there intending to discover that. I just lived in that environment along with my peers here at Congregation Beth Evergreen in that environment. It was run by a gentleman named Dick Vickery, and Dick Vickery used to call Congregation Beth Evergreen his angels, or their angels. It wasn't his angels, their angels. They charged us no rent. They had a large wooden cross that sort of hung mid-sanctuary, as it were, over the piano area. And folks from Congregation Beth Evergreen would show up in the parking lot. Whoever was first, bring the Torah. The Torah arrived in a gun case that was built by Albert, which I always felt was a beautiful symbol of beating your swords into plowshares and converting symbols of one thing into symbols of another thing, sort of a reconstruction of that object, but made by hand for a new purpose, which I thought was really beautiful. And we would stand up on a chair and lift this cross, like a bunch of Jews lifting a cross off of it, and we would put it aside. And all with permission, all with the grace of the United Methodist Church. And I can say that even now, as a member, a former leader of Congregation Beth Evergreen, that if we had the open heart to make sure that when others came here, that beautiful acceptance was there. And downstairs from the United Methodist Church's sanctuary area was a little playroom and a little school, not so dissimilar from ours, cluttered up, I'm sure not fire safe, stuff stacked up everywhere as preschools are wont to do. And they had what today would not be politically correct term for it, but it was called Mommy's Day Out. And you would take your little gaggle, and so we had 3, and drop them off. And there in that location, they would typically be tended by none other than Randy Murray, who worked at Mommy's Day Out or Mom's Day Out at least one day a week. And I think Thursdays we would drop our kids off there. And so that location became central to my family's experience of living here, how to live here, how to be. And at services in that period of time, so again, I started in 95, I wasn't president until 2003, which is a matter of running and ducking responsibility as frequently and often as you can. This is not an office you run for, it's an office you run from. And in fact, David told the story of how he got run into. There was a meeting called at my house. Like, I didn't run, okay? People came to my door, and Joanne Greenberg was there. She's there for everything, by the way. And she says to me in this meeting, "Do you take things personally?" I said, "When they're personal." And she says, "I mean, do you have a thick skin?" I said, "Yeah, but I don't want to use it. Like, like, what is this interview like? What are we talking about?" But anyway, from 1995 to 2003, we enjoyed that location, and we had a phenomenal rabbi, Elliot Baskin, and he was a beloved presence. He was everything we wanted, and at times everything we didn't want, which made him like every other rabbi. Like, we loved him, and then at times we couldn't love him. But what we loved about him wasn't just himself, and he was great. He was an entertainer. He would perform magic, like literally perform magic at Passover. He would turn water into wine, and I don't know all of his tricks. They were as corny as they could be, but they were effective and fun. And his demeanor, like Maya Angelou says, right? We won't remember what people say, but we'll remember how they made you feel. He made you feel welcomed, loved, accepted, never judged. It was never about him. It was about the group. And he had a darling wife who was his equal in every way, and she was a genius, and she was accomplished, and she still is. And he had 2 absolutely terrific and lovely children who would show up to synagogue. All 4 of them would show up, and they would be as rowdy as every other kid, as disruptive as we want all of our kids to be in services, right? And they made it feel great. And they built a home here, and they were terrific. But like all synagogues, David tells the story, it was 84, and it was 94, and now we're up to 03. And now 20 years have gone by, and we have this survey, and this survey is like, it should be etched in dust, right? It has virtually no meaning from Steve Bernstein till 2003. But it had these 3 priorities. Let's talk about whether we want to affiliate, and do we want to, by the way, Elliot Baskin was a part-time rabbi. Do we want to hire? It was because guess what we had? $67 a year budget. Like, that's not good. And do we want to build a building? In other words, do we want to leave this church to do this? And the synagogue was becoming what it is today and what it is every day, but more and more and more cohesive, and more fractured. right? Like there's 150 opinions given about this subject, and if anyone wants to summarize them, I'd love to hear it. But the questions still live. Do we want to affiliate? Do we want a full-time rabbi? Do we want a building? And we couldn't hide from those questions anymore by 2003. So in 2003, the tensions were overtaking the cohesion, right? And those tensions were producing people leaving and people of very good will fracturing. And David, the whole time, has been laboring to put together a group of people to build the building, which he named the Minyan Committee, or the Minyan, and it was 10 people more or less, emphasis on the less, who we were aspirational in calling it a Minyan, and he convened a meeting. When David convenes a meeting and he asks you to be there, he has a way of asking with the answer in mind, as though you're giving the answer. So our family showed up, and David put this together. He put all of the right people together to find this land. And on this land, many of you will remember, some of you didn't see it, but I assure you it did not look like this. It had a dilapidated old house that none of you would buy. None of you would want to live in. It was small, rickety, old, had weird shag carpet. Nothing seemed safe about it. You remember.
Shag carpet museum.
Yeah.
Every room had a different color of shag carpet, and one room had polka dotted shag, had like the sprinkles on a birthday cake, shag carpet that looked like that. I mean, it was unbelievable.
If
An extra residence in the basement.
yes. Yes. David has a flash memory of trying to tear it down. And so, but David had done a masterful job in cobbling together donors. He references Paul Rothman. There were several other donors, 10 other donors, to cobble together the money to purchase the land. When you purchase the land, you have not purchased the building. You haven't purchased the operating costs of the building. You haven't purchased the insurance or anything else, but we had enough money. Or the architect. Hollis remembers the architect because we had a moment. And Hollis was on the board from 03 to 05, right? Yeah. Executive, yeah, you were on before me. So I was another 2-year guy. I didn't have David's line, but I had his ethos. If I can't do it in 2 years, what's the use? So, where am I? I was an imposter of David. So it's true. You say no, but it's true. So, in so many ways. So in 2003, we wanted to try to tackle the 3 items that were on the list. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. We had events at the house, and we tried to build vision. We had visioning. So David was phenomenal. Do you want to talk a little bit about, do you want me to talk about affiliation, or what would you like to talk about?
Let's talk a little more about the building before we move on.
Here you go.
Yes. Well, in terms of investment, I don't recall investing that money. I think we were scared to death of losing it. We were so happy to have it. But, the $100,000, it was a large gift, but the significance of it was much greater. It was taking us from the point of daydreaming about a building to now we got to do something about a building. And at that point, you know, it was time to step it up and get and make some forward progress. And so, and that wasn't a unanimous opinion. There were many congregants that were very happy with where we were in the Methodist Church. And personally, I loved the Methodist Church, but personally, I always felt as though we were guests there. It wasn't our home. We had a very gracious host. We couldn't have asked for a better host, but it was still not our home. And that I felt as though the Jewish community deserved its own home, to feel like we had a place that signified that we were here, We weren't, you know, just here in a transitory kind of fashion, but we were here to stay. And that was what really motivated me on the building side. And the building, the fundraising for the building was a major endeavor. It was very difficult initially to raise the money for the building, because there was still, because of the years of talking about this building that had already taken place, there was an underlying skepticism, I think, that this was actually going to happen. And it made it difficult for people to open up their checkbooks. And so what we ended up doing is taking some of that $100,000 and hiring an architect who drew the plans for this building that you're sitting in. And it was a two-phase plan, and I brought those plans with me tonight if anyone's interested in seeing them after we finish talking your ear off here. But, and so now we had something that said, you know, we're not just talking about a synagogue, here it is. And even that wasn't quite enough. So it was recommended to us by other congregations that had successfully built their own building to build a wooden model of the building. So we built a scale model of this building. It was maybe the size of about 5 of these chairs next to each other, 4 or 5 of these chairs. And those of us who were working on fundraising, I didn't say throw because it was very delicate, put it in the back of our car and drove around to congregants' homes and took it out of our car and set it down on their cocktail table. And I said, here's our building. You know, this is it. This is real. You know, and if you want to support this, and we need everybody to support it in order to make it happen, we need you to open up your checkbook and write a check to whatever amount is comfortable. We were really looking for 100% participation, and the congregation responded. The congregation responded to an extent that we felt that we could go ahead and start this project. It was, at that moment, so exciting for the congregation. Everybody wanted to be on the building committee. Everybody. So we had a building committee sign up of, I think, 15 or so people. And I spent 6 weeks trying to find a date for our first meeting that everybody could make. And at that point, I said, this isn't going to work. And more or less disbanded the building committee and formed a much smaller building committee that was comprised of a very capable contractor whose office is across the street, Andy Ades, who builds very high-end custom homes to this date, who really was the backbone of the project. Hanan Dayan, who has a history as a commercial developer as well. Joe Wildenberg contributed significantly to the interior design of the project. And it was really, you know, about 4 of us that rolled up our sleeves and met with the architects and did the work to make the project physically happen, but it was the entire congregation that did the harder work, which is to fund the project. And it was, I think, if I remember, a $2.6 million project, which at the time seemed like a horrendous amount of money. Am I close? Do you recall, Dick? I think it was 2.6. And we figured we had to raise $1.6 million, and we would take out a loan for $1 million. And we met that goal. The project took 5 years from the date that we purchased the land to its completion in the fall of 2003, when we held our first high holiday services here.
We're going to do a little fact checking. Yeah, so yeah, the building process was tremendously unifying and exciting, and I was glad to be in a community that was engaged in doing that. Our departure from the United Methodist Church had some mutuality to it. We were definitely not pressured out, but we were growing, and with our growth came, you know, more events and more usage and all of that. And so it felt organic and like it was time. We had grown to a size when we might be able to support some of this aspiration. When the building was finally complete, it was in what I get about mid-2003, and we moved in and we went to the United Methodist Church for our last meeting there. We had a ceremony where we honored the church. We gave speeches in their honor. We brought gifts in their honor to leave with them. And we had a processional that was led by Joanne. Well, I remember handing you the Torah.
Oh, yes, I walked with it, but there were people all around.
There were other people. Yeah, you didn't lead it. You were a leader in it. How about that? Yeah, yep. And so we all walked the distance from the United Methodist Church here, and we installed the Torah that you mentioned. I think it was one of these miracle days when it rained but nobody got wet. So yeah, especially the Torah. But a lovely day of celebration, and we were here, and that was, I believe it was in the sort of rainy days of June that we had that opportunity. So where do you want to go next? Affiliation. So in 2003, when we did get here and we started to hold services here, on our first high holiday services in the new building, which, by the way, looks just like this, right? This is what we came to. And David had mentioned that we were a two-phase building project. And phase two is yet to come. We have not yet had phase two, but phase one looks like it did now, and Jill Wildenberg had a real vision, former president, had a real vision for building a religious school downstairs. And so it was designed the way it's designed now, and ideally for a religious school, but we also were realistic about the fact that we had all kinds of budget problems. And the budget problems had to do with two things. One is that, you know, building a building is one thing. You can pay for the bricks and mortar, but you're left with $1 million mortgage, and you're left with all the overhead. You've got the taxes and the insurance, maybe not the taxes, you've got the insurance and the lighting and the heat and the repairs and all of that. And so we knew we needed to build an operation inside the building that could fund it, which meant, one, we had to improve our dues structure. 67 wasn't going to cut it. So we had to introduce to our community culture that we were going to have a sustainable dues culture. And we had to have buy-in around doing that. We also wanted to share the ethos of having other tenants. So we invited several churches to locate themselves here and to worship in this sanctuary, which was, I think, a tremendous tradition and lasted for quite some time. And downstairs, we wanted to have an actual preschool, not just a Jewish Wednesday religious school. And so we worked with the people who were building the school up on the hill here, who wanted a preschool for their school as a feeder program. And we brought these stakeholders together. At the same time, there had been a lot of discussion about the need to transition to a full-time rabbi. And Elliot Baskin, who we loved and who helped us move into this building, didn't want to be a full-time rabbi, and there were a lot of tensions around his participation and what that would look like. And his wife, who had a thriving practice, had brought that down the hill, and they had bought a house down the hill. So the culture was shifting. And at that time, we decided to shift as well. And I think as a grown man, I can think of 6 times when I've wept. And the day I had to, as president of the synagogue, say goodbye to Elliot Baskin, and I drove down to Denver to do that. That was like the first time as a grown man that I remember just the tremendous sadness around it. And it was because I felt like someone had been hurt, and in a sense had been hurt by the community, someone that we cared about and that we loved and respected, and who should have a presence here at this time and who had really brought us quite a long way, had been hurt, and that I had in part been the instrument of that. Alongside that, though, we needed to figure out how to continue to do this work of building a holy community and engaging in mature relationships with spiritual leadership, with someone who would be a central presence, a radiating center for the congregation, and who we could bring in to fulfill the role of being a full-time rabbi. And so we had a rabbi search committee. And when I say we, I'm really talking about the board and the rabbi search committee. Dick, you were on the board, and Hollis as well. You were on that? You were one of the 2 members of was it 2 or 3 members of the rabbi search committee? I know Neshama helped you. I know Alan was on it. I know Phil was on it, and I know you were on it, right? Here, oh, that can wait till tomorrow. Okay. I'll finish this part. How about that? Okay. So we put together, we had a board that attempted to be very inclusive because we believed in values-based decision-making. So we didn't want, while we have something like a hierarchical structure of lay leadership with a president and a vice president, a secretary, a board, we wanted full community involvement, and we wanted full community participation in all of the opinions at the table. So we we engaged with several denominations. We engaged with the Reforms, we engaged with the Reconstructionists in soliciting candidates to become the rabbi of Congregation Beth Evergreen. David didn't mention it, but well prior, early in the 90s, we switched from the Orthodox prayer books to the prayer books that we have behind you right now, and those are created by the Reconstructionist movement. So surreptitiously, without adopting the brand or paying the money to affiliate with the Reconstructionist movement, we had their prayer books here. And anyone who spent time in that prayer book has seen that beneath the line, oftentimes there's very inspiring comment, some of which is by a gentleman named Rami Shapiro, Rabbi Rami Shapiro. During the year when Joanne and the others were leading the rabbi search committee, we invited guest rabbis to come here once a month across a series of 8 or 9 months during this search process as live interviews of a sort. And we would host them for the weekend. There would be educational moments, there would be religious school moments, and then there would be service moments. And we had, for example, Rami Shapiro come once, and he was wonderful. He was theatrical. He's as brilliant live as he is as an author. If you can buy any of the books by Rami Shapiro, you're going to love them. But he also has the ethos and background as a Reconstructionist. So we had many Reform rabbis come here. We had one moment where we had a Reform rabbi who didn't show up for services, which gave us the chance to be truly Reconstructionist and do lay-led services and to adapt and to be on the fly. And as I remember it anyway, and again, this could be Mythbusters, Joanne says, here's the decision of the Rabbi Search Committee. We have narrowed it down to 3, and we recommend any of the above. So Joanne and her group left it to the board to make that selection. But there's one other component that I want to modify slightly of what David said. And I'm sure he's right, but I'm going to tell the myth. we didn't have enough money to transition into this building because that would require a transition from a construction loan to a mortgage. We had to retire the construction loan that had built the building and turn it into a mortgage. And the covenant in the mortgage required that we have a certain amount of skin in the game, and we were $100,000 short at High Holidays. And we were at the end of the time period necessary to make that change, and the building and the land were held as security for the construction loan. And believe it or not, banks, I know we all think of them as philanthropists, but they will foreclose on a sanctuary, and they have. We actually had good bankers, they worked with us, but at High Holidays in the first year while I was here, the board said, you have to make the pitch, and you have to ask, and you have to tell them, and you have to make the case, and you have to tell them the reasons. And I remember being terrified because I have imposter syndrome, that I'm the wrong guy for that job too. And that night, at Break the Fast at my home, people came up and they made their pledges. And by the end of High Holidays, we had bridged the gap with the last $100,000. And in terms of raising this money, what we had was a ethos that we wanted 100% participation, that every single person in the synagogue, either through a checkbook or through a contribution of in-kind services or through giving of materials, would participate. And by the end of the time when we had to retire the construction loan, we had 100% participation by every single member of the synagogue. Dick is here and he'll amen this, I think, that on the board that we ran for 2 years during the period of time in which we had to retire the construction loan, we had to build the budget, which meant adjust all the dues, make the decision on affiliation, make the decision on hiring a full-time rabbi, that we never had a dissenting vote at a board meeting, that every single vote was unanimous by the time we took the vote, and on one occasion we had one abstention on one issue. But other than that, the board was dedicated to process and dedicated to the hard work and would do the doing and stay and discuss and resolve. And if we didn't have agreement, table the issue, do a study, come back with a recommendation, and repropose it. There was never a cram down in that board, and I think it really reflects well on the congregation and the people who decided to participate in building consensus. And so I want to thank Dick and Hollis as well, and Neshama, who's probably on. Dick is pulling the mic, and then give it to Joanne.
I'm pulling this mic because that was the best board I was ever on in my life. And this is the man who ran it. And it was because of Rich that we had the cohesiveness and the drive to get done everything we had to do.
Ha, ha, ha on you. He's got tough oats. He's got his story, I've got mine. When we started to get a rabbi, we went to the reform group. Now, we were at that time, I'm talking about long before we had a synagogue or even the Methodist Church. Remember who we were. The reform, we wanted a rabbi first. They did not give us the top students that were there because we were, how many were we? And we didn't have any money and we weren't all that much. So we tended to get the B- and C+ candidates. And we went through some pretty okay, hit it, pretty awful candidates before we got Rabbi Baskin. The same thing happened only in reverse when we were thinking about getting a rabbi. They were sending people from well, we wore them out. They didn't want to see us after that. But when we were doing the Reconstructionist one, we got people that I thought were wonderful, and I thought, and the people on the search committee thought, quick, get this person before everybody else does. And you were the one who kept saying, process. We're going to go throughout we're going to do the whole thing. We're going to see all of these people one after the other. Now, guess what? Number one was using us as leverage for a job she really wanted in California. Numero due, she wanted to be a cantor. She didn't really want to be a rabbi. Back there, they said she can be a cantor. She was gone. Number three, number four, and guess what happened? We got the guy we should have gotten. Had we not done what you said, we wouldn't have gotten him. So guess what? You are, Rich, the real thing. You are the real thing.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Dick. I want to say something about selecting the rabbi and talk about Jamie a little bit. So the Rabbi Search Committee did an amazing job surfacing candidates. Neshama did a phenomenal job as our executive director. At the time, she was our vice president and she was on the board. She hadn't yet become executive director. I think that was a little later in the process. But she would create these weekends for these candidates to come in, and then she would gather all of the feedback. And she was as vital to this process. It would not be, you couldn't exaggerate how vital she was to this process. At the end, when we were trying to make an offer, and selecting a rabbi is, that's part of the hard work, but it's not all of the hard work. Some of the hard work is negotiating a contract with someone who doesn't live here, inspiring the confidence that we're going to make it work, and making the arrangements for them to come here. So that means going to other places to meet with them. And so at first I had gone to New York to meet with a candidate rabbi who had been here and had gained the support of the board. It didn't work out for reasons that are not important. But then I flew to Florida a couple of weeks later because Jamie Arnold, who was also from New York, was in Florida performing a funeral for his grandfather, correct? So I get to Florida and I see Jamie Arnold and I meet him at the point in time when he's going to be doing a loved one's funeral. He comes and he meets me, I think in a food court, right, in Fort Lauderdale with his lovely wife, with their children. I believe two or maybe all three of the children were there, and you were there, I think, monitoring the kids. And your mother. And I remember, it is another Maya Angelou moment where you don't remember what people will say, but you will remember how they make you feel. And I remember Jamie having the grace and the gravitas and the wisdom and the presence that everyone in this room has felt from him, right? That you may not remember sermons or you may not remember specific teachings, although there are many sermons that I remember and many teachings that I remember, but you will not forget his heart and his presence and how you feel when he looks at you, when he addresses you, and how that makes you feel. And you would not forget his 3 kids and his wife and how that made you feel. And they were a fantastic family. And I remember in that moment, at that location saying, wow, I'm not selecting a rabbi, I'm asking an entire family, would they come and be members of our synagogue with us? And that family became a cornerstone of who we are. There's no one in our kids' generation that doesn't remember growing up with your grandchildren, right? My wife was a public school teacher for 2 of your kids. I was one of your kids' 7th grade teachers. Love them all dearly, and we've had them in our home, and we've had them here at synagogue, and we've had special events around them. And Jamie came to us from the Reconstructionist synagogue. And tying it back to Elliot Baskin, one of the major problems that the congregation had in structuring a relationship with Elliot was that he didn't have the support of a reform movement that we had affiliated with. So when we had trouble and drama, there was no fixed point of reference that we could all agree on how to proceed from. I felt it was vital for the success of a rabbi for us to affiliate with the movement from which that rabbi came, so that we had a systematic structure where we could agree on the rules of engagement, because there's going to be disagreement, right? And both sides in that disagreement are going to be right and wrong on various things. There's all kinds of issues. There's budgets, there's 401ks, there's insurance, there's who leads at the bima, there's what are the policies in the sanctuary around ritual objects, what is our approach to interfaith, right? There's so much that goes on. And the one thing about a rabbi that I think membership can't always appreciate is what's invisible to membership that a rabbi does, that any rabbi in any congregation does. The number of bereavement calls that a rabbi has to make, the number of times someone shows up with an important problem to discuss and decides to overshare, right? The number of emails that they get, right? All of those aspects are part of the job that, because of the relationship of confidentiality and intimacy, don't get shared with the group. So there's a few people who know what that management problem is. Marilyn's one of them, right? Because listen, I have the good grace and good fortune of having hired Rabbi Jamie Arnold, and the good grace and the good fortune to have never had to manage him, because this guy showed up. My daughter, my plan, my secret private plot and motivation for being president was my daughter was going to be bat mitzvahed my oldest daughter was going to be bat mitzvahed during my term, and Jamie came the week after. So we closed out our journey in the wilderness between Baskin and Arnold with a series of visiting rabbis, and mine was the last of the visiting rabbis. So I just want to say that was a vital part of the process, and vital in terms of how we selected to affiliate with the Reconstructionist movement, who have been useful to myself and to other presidents, I think, throughout when we have times of stress and trouble. So, and they've been great for us in a number of ways, including with the religious school downstairs. So at any rate, during that period of time from 03 to 05, those were the things that got done. We finished the building, especially on the financial side. I think Dave finished it, by putting the last stroke of paint and the last, fixtures on the walls. And then we finished with the funding of it, did the hiring of a rabbi and the affiliation. And our affiliation process, by the way, was filled with what? What's Reconstructionist? My mother will flip, my father will flip. I came from a conservative this, and our family is dedicated to the reform. We had a president of the synagogue who was part of the humanist Jewish movement, right? And so it was no stretch to say, oh, we were a bit like Mormons. We would baptize people Reconstructionist. You've been Reconstructionist and didn't know it because we've had their books. Right? You're Reconstructionist and you didn't know it because we hired a Reconstructionist rabbi, right? And we're just going to sort of lift the veil off of that process. But I don't think there was a single no vote in the congregation on Jamie, and there was no single no vote on the question of affiliation. And the dues structure, there was not a single no vote on having a dues structure or being responsible to what our responsibilities are. Finish it.
I don't know what else to say after that, Rich. You know, here we are today, and go ahead, Sally.
I just wanted to say one thing about, that I remember about, oops, about getting the rabbi, was that we could not get Jamie Arnold unless we affiliated with the Reconstructionist movement. And Karen Bennett and there were 7, Lisa Deutsch, and there were 7 of us, Maureen Spiegelman, and we had our Benot Mitzvah in June of '05, and he didn't come until, I think it was July, and I have never let him forget that he missed our Benot Mitzvah.
That just hasn't been said. We had enormous support from the entire Jewish community in the Denver area. There were so many people down there that for so many years had seen us indirectly going through all of this. There were synagogues that were supportive that would come up to our services, cantors that would come from Denver, including Steve Brodsky and others. Robbie Sherwin came from everywhere, from Austin and Gunnison, and helped with so many of the things. I remember in particular an amazing Sukkot service at the rat or the mouse infested, let's be fair, mice, not rats, the mice infested building, and we had this amazing Sukkot service, and it's a construction zone. We are not allowed to be here having services. And we walked out the front, and there was this huge full moon, and all the participants in that evening service, we just had a delight. The Intermountain Jewish News was, which is for lack of a better term, a conservative, I don't know, I don't like the labels, but politically conservative, sometimes too much for some people, but they were incredibly supportive, and they showed us how to do, we wanted to do some advertising, and I actually brought it today in my car. I'll bring it inside because I'm giving this box of stuff to get ready for the Jubilee celebration. And they showed us how to fundraise to get a full-page ad. You get a bunch of businesses, and they ringed the ad, and we had full-page ads in all kinds of papers, all throughout the area, from all the way down 285 and all sorts of places. And they covered our opening. They covered our rabbi, and they were very, very supportive back in those days of, even though most of their readership was probably very different, not necessarily Reconstruction Jews? But I just wanted to add that piece, that the entire Denver community welcomed us and still does, and it was a big, big deal at a time when synagogues, in a century when synagogues are closing and everybody's aging out and everybody's, for lack of a better term, dying. And all of a sudden, here was a new synagogue with new building and lots of kids in religious school. And so I just wanted to add that little piece because it's part of the history that I have always drawn strength from.
Hollis was a huge part of our board, and I would say this, every time I'm in a room with Hollis, I know I'm not the smartest person in the room. So, but there's others on that list too. So, but yeah, so thank you for everything you did.
And I believe at the time that the doors opened on the synagogue, we were only the second synagogue ever in the county of Jefferson here in Colorado. And the first one was turn of the century. It was a turn of the century down in Golden that didn't exist at the time, obviously, when we built this one. It's the largest county in the state, and we were the only Jewish synagogue. And really, in my mind, the first, but technically the second. So it's something that we're here. It's something, and it says something to the community, and it says something that we are a community. And it just feels really good to be in a space like this that we can call our own. Anybody would like to see the plans for the second phase, I'd be happy to spend a few minutes on back on the table there. And thank you all for listening to all of this jibber jabber from me and from.
Does anyone want to share anything before we close?
I would like to. This is Susie Spear on Zoom. First, I want to.
Hold on, online. Hold on. I think we're waiting to hear.
Oh, can you hear me?
Elizabeth is trying to get the volume on. We're having technical difficulties, and I'm not sure they're going to get resolved. There's an.
So the architect's concept of this building in its completion, both phases, is that it's a menorah, and that we're actually sitting in the stem of the menorah currently, and the branches of the menorah would be built in the second phase and would house a larger sanctuary and a social hall. This space that we're sitting in would be part of the religious school, and it was designed specifically so it could be divided into classrooms. And the area that is now our social hall was envisioned as administrative space for a larger synagogue. And so we have a drawing, more than a drawing, we have schematics on what the entirety of the project could look like. And it was based on an unknown as far as where the synagogue was going in terms of growth. We didn't know, once we had a building, we had no idea of knowing what that would mean in terms of the growth of the synagogue. Obviously, it was going to get bigger because there were folks that wanted to be in a synagogue instead of worshiping in a church or going down the hill to join another congregation. But at the same time, we didn't know how many Jews were up here that we were going to be able to have as members. So the second phase, it was a wish list for something down the road in the event that we got to be a bigger synagogue and needed the space.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone on Zoom. Thank you.